The title of my talk is The Christian Life in the Technological Society, which is a reference to a work by the French philosopher that CJ mentioned this morning, Jacques Ellul, which is entitled The Technological Society. For this last plenary session, in case all this time, just in case, even though it's been said repeatedly, just in case you were still thinking that this was a Luddite conference where we all just rail against the use of machines and labor-saving devices, I would like to reinforce the point that the core issue that we have been discussing is much deeper, and the challenges we face in our darkened world are much greater than we can truly grasp. If only it were so easy as to simply renounce the use of machines and technology to fix the world we're living in. Perhaps convincing enough people to do so would solve our problems. On the contrary, the issues are much more complex, and the negative trends in modern society are much harder to reverse. Thus, I'm here to give the last talk and assure you all, and especially CJ, who's in for the long defeat, that we end this conference on a somewhat pessimistic note. As I said, the real problem we face in the modern world is not merely the presence of machines. The real problem, according to Jacques Ellul, is what he calls technique. Now, I could fill the next couple of hours speaking on topics of technique, propaganda, and the artificiality of modern society. Not because I'm an expert, but simply because Ellul has produced a lot of content on this. However, due to time constraints, I'm going to focus on simply defining this concept of technique, which still will take a little time, and drawing out its impact on economics, politics, and most especially Christianity, and how we conceive of Christianity. So what is technique? Ellul defines technique as, quote, a collection of methods that are rationally developed to produce the most efficient way to achieve an end in any field of human activity. A collection of methods that are rationally developed to produce the most efficient way to achieve an end in any field of human activity. In explaining this definition, Ellul takes pains to distinguish machines from technique. Machines are mere inanimate objects. They don't have consciousness. Machines cannot take over a society. Machines in and of themselves do not transform society or produce social change. For example, let's take the invention of the automobile. What good is the invention of the automobile in a society that does not have roads to drive on, but mere walking trails? You can invent the automobile, and it does nothing to change society. Drop an automobile into the middle of an Amish community, and there's no radical change within that society. Technique, on the other hand, is a way of thinking that says, since we have the automobile, we must cut down the trees, widen the trails into roads, and pave them because we must use this machine to increase the speed of transportation for the good of society. That's technique. Another example, the first steam locomotive was invented in 1802. That did not immediately lead to the building of the Union Pacific Railroad. To take on the investment and the commitment of putting in a railroad stretching from the cities along the eastern seaboard to the Pacific Ocean required a mentality that was convinced that this was a good idea and that this was what progress required. Along the way, there were many choices that had to be made. It wasn't as if the locomotive was invented and choice no longer entered the equation because people were somehow inevitably driven towards a cross-country railroad. So what is it that guided these choices? Technique, a collection of methods that are rationally developed to produce the most efficient way to achieve an end in any field of human activity. Technique suggests that the most rational, the most efficient, the most automated course must be taken, and humans must constantly be looking to augment their capabilities to achieve greater results. Not only does technique need to be differentiated from machines, we need to recognize that technique does not adapt machines to the needs of human beings. Technique does not adapt machines to the needs of human beings. Rather, technique adapts human beings to the reality of the machine. Lovell asks us to think about the ways that modern life has robbed us of our humanity. We could engage in a little thought experiment of our own here to flesh out this point. Think about this. We live in an increasingly unhealthy society, and with living unhealthy lives, impersonal lives, in a rat race to survive. Depression, loneliness, insecurity, purposelessness, addiction, and suicide plague our modern culture. We are more dependent creatures and driven by consumption and pleasure than we have ever been. And what do we call this? What's the word for all of this? Progress. Progress. This is all progress. You don't synthesize the data here. If you take the data, you don't comb through the data and come to the conclusion that this is progress and that the progress must continue at all costs without some serious propaganda driving it. Technique is a way of thinking and analyzing the data that will always justify the need for more technique. We've been trained to think that every problem we face must have a technical solution. Thus, we constantly pursue more techniques that make yesterday's techniques obsolete. Well, you might say, maybe it's just the fact that we live in a scientific age. Maybe there's nothing at all nefarious about what Lovell refers to as technique. It's just part and parcel of living in an age of scientific discovery and innovation. And if that is the case, I mean, what's the counter? Are you saying you want to ban science? We just shut our brains off and we don't investigate anything anymore? Look at all the good scientific discoveries have done for humanity. Lovell counters such a notion by saying that technique is not merely an application of scientific discovery, but it's that which precedes or lays the groundwork for scientific discovery. In other words, when we speak of technique, we're not talking about Gregor Mendel experimenting with pea plants to learn about genetics. We're not talking about Sir Isaac Newton theorizing about gravitational pull, or about Galileo observing the surface of the moon with a telescope. Technique does not simply apply science. It is what determines the goal that of the scientists that they seek to accomplish. Technique sets the goals for scientific innovation. Technique is what sets the scientists to work, insisting that they must come up with a superweapon like an atomic bomb or a vaccination for COVID. The goal is out there. Technique says what the goal has to be, and then the scientists must go to work to solve the problem. Lovell says that those who we refer to today as scientists are really nothing more than lab technicians. Technique sets the agenda, and the funding only goes to the scientific research that serves the agenda of the managerial elite. Now, before moving on, I'd like to provide a couple more concrete illustrations that hopefully will solidify our understanding of technique. So, my father is a dairy farmer and has been for his entire life. He knows everything there is to know about Holstein cows. When I was younger, he prided himself on being not just a farmer, but a dairyman. He knows how to breed for optimal milk production as well as for improving the dairy features of cattle. He knows the animals and what combinations of minerals and nutrients their bodies need at different times in their milking cycle. I remember we had a room in our house where the wall was covered in plaques that he won for producing the highest quality milk in our region. So milk isn't just milk after all. There's different qualities to it: butterfat content, protein content, low somatic cell count. He had the skill and the knowledge of how to do that. He could spot medical symptoms and treat cattle accordingly. These are skills that have been accumulated over the course of a lifetime of experience. Now, as farming becomes more and more industrialized and automated, there are now farmers that can come into the business and run enormous operations. You almost have to anymore. If you're a small farmer going out there, they won't even accept you. You'd have to run an enormous operation, and people do. And so they have an operation where they would milk thousands of cattle. Parlors are built. A milking parlor where you could milk 8, 12, 20, 30 cattle at a time. They file through a gate, walk into the parlor, and all you have to know is how to put the milker on. And you know what? You don't even have to know that, because the newer systems have what are called automated hookups. You push a button and all the milkers go on. The cows will milk out. You push the button to open the gate. They exit the parlor, next group files in, process is repeated. You can hire people to milk the cows even if they have no experience or knowledge of how to care for animals. The feeding of large herds is done by machines. It follows a formula. Some feeding systems are so sophisticated today that the machines will put out feed into the trough based on the chip in the tag of the animal's ear. How much have they had today? What rations do they still need today? So, conceivably, if you said to someone who was hired to work on a farm for, let's say they were working on a farm 2, 3, 4 years, you say, I bet you know a lot about cows. They might say, I have no idea. I just push the buttons. It's very possible through technique and systems to work on a farm and not know much of anything about the animals you're working with. Another quick example. Here I'm going to pick on Evan Hughes. Evan is a craftsman and an artist. Now, if you've ever seen Evan's work, he makes custom furniture with tremendous skill. He has a very specific knowledge of the wood and the tools he uses to fashion something into a beautiful work of art. Now, what if we were to compare what Evan does to, say, being an employee at IKEA? The technique or the system at IKEA requires you to repeatedly cut the board, cut the board, cut the board, pre-drill the hole, pre-drill the hole, pre-drill the hole. Make sure there's enough screws in this bag. Make sure there's enough tools. Assemble the parts and ship them out. Again, you could talk to somebody who works at an IKEA factory and say, you must know a lot about woodworking and furniture design. And they would say, I have not a clue. The technical knowledge required to work in an industrial or a post-industrial economy is not the same as the specialized skill acquired from long experience or mastery of a craft. Now, given the definition and the illustrations of technique I've provided, you might respond by saying that technique is not particularly unique to modern society. Technique has been around forever. Primitive tools like the shovel or the wheel are technologies that would have had a similar effect on their respective societies thousands of years ago. But as CJ mentioned this morning, there is a difference between a tool society, a technocracy, and a technopoly. So tools are not just tools or tools or tools. But even more to that point, this is a common objection that you may have heard. Like, hey, if you're against technology, boy, you better give up everything you have. Give up on the wheel. Go live in the woods if you don't like technology, right? Who are you to complain? Technology is just neutral. So if you don't like it, you got to get rid of all of it if you're going to be consistent. Ellul rejects this, and he points out that there were factors in the past that limited the transforming effects of technique upon society. First, he says, technique in pre-modern society was applied only in certain narrow, limited areas. Technique was utilized only in a small sphere of one's life. And even within that sphere, technical activity was not the main purpose of that activity. For example, have you ever seen the Amish build a barn? This is Pennsylvania, not all of you are from here. But have you ever seen or heard of the Amish and how they build a barn? The Amish are incredibly efficient at this. You can watch buildings go up in a day. The whole community comes together and everyone works to build the barn for one of their own, and it can go up, as I said, in a day or two. They're definitely using techniques, aren't they, to operate so efficiently. But the use of the technique is not the main purpose of their activity. They aren't out there building barns every day so that they can institute industrialized farming or meet a quota for barns. The main purpose of that barn building event is community, the community that is shared in that event. They happen to use tools, but the purpose is not to use the tools to mass produce barns. So that's one difference. Another, in pre-modern societies, Ellul says, there were limitations on technical means. There were fewer tools, which meant that people relied more on talent and skill. In other words, it's not just a matter of saying technique is technique. Sometimes you have more of it, sometimes you have less. And the less technique that you have in a society, the more individual talent needs to make up for it. You see the difference? There's a difference between me holding a tool and knowing how to push buttons on a big machine and, say, Evan using a tool and crafting a piece of furniture. The talent makes up for the difference in the tools. So a society with fewer tools means you have a society that is relying on individual skills that are developed over time and passed down from generation to generation, which limits the need for more technique. Third, technique in pre-modern society was localized. A machine was not invented and then immediately distributed across the country or the world. Man, therefore, had time to adapt to the new technology created and the new environment resulting from that creation or discovery. It was not just because someone invented something somewhere, now we got to have it in China and India and all across the U.S. Everybody must have it if they want to keep up. Man, therefore, had time to adapt to that new technology. It was not foisted on a community like it is today. So fourth point, why is this different? Why is technique in the modern world different? Technique was limited in pre-modern societies by choice. You can get, man could in pre-modern society easily choose not to participate in the use of a new tool or machine. Modern societies only present the illusion of choice. So you can get the newest Android or the newest iPhone, but you must get a cell phone. How can you do your job unless you have all these apps? And only the latest versions of the phone will support the apps. You can have a fuel-efficient vehicle made with plastic parts, or a fuel-efficient vehicle with plastic parts, with plastic parts, or that fuel-efficient, you can have a fuel-efficient with plastic parts, or you can have one that's more expensive and fancier, and maybe less fuel efficient, but you must have a car. You can't go without a car. That's not really an option. Imagine being a farmer today and saying you were going to compete in the marketplace without using a tractor. Imagine trying to be a teacher, but you're not going to use a computer. Imagine saying, I'm going to go get a job, but I'm going to do one where I can walk to it. Choices are pretty limited, even with modern zoning, right? You pretty much have to get a car. You must get the newest technology, the new cell phone, the new car, whatever it is, because the old one is quickly becoming obsolete. And this is what supposedly prosperity looks like. But in the reality is you're trapped. You're told that you're free because you can drive a car with all the new features and provide comfort and convenience. But the reality is you can't get parts to drive a lot of older cars. Technique says there must constantly be innovation. Constantly there must be change. The old must be replaced with something new. And you're free to choose from as many options as you like as long as you choose from the newest options, the most recent upgrades. So what are the implications of technique? I've spent all of this time hopefully not giving you just a term called technique that if you were asked about it, say, oh, it's this nefarious, mysterious thing. Hopefully you can walk away from this saying, yeah, I'll give you an exact example of what this looks like. So I've spent this lengthy amount of time talking about what is technique, why is it particularly problematic in the modern world, and what it looks like. So what are the implications of technique? I would like to consider some economic and political implications first before we spend some time thinking through the religious implications, or the effects of technique, in other words, on the Christian life. First, economically, technique has created a world where workers lack real skills. The entire point of modern education is to create workers that are not highly skilled, but rather are interchangeable parts in a global economic machine. We don't pursue knowledge anymore. We pursue certification, right? Are you certified? You have that little piece of paper. You're required to be certified in technical training, not necessarily educated. We don't pursue virtue anymore. We don't learn what it means to love one's neighbor. We simply verify that we've watched the HR training video and know how to be nice and avoid political incorrectness. The point is not to develop a chef. The point is to make sure after a week of training you know how to flip the burger properly. In a fast-paced global economy where systems, machines, jobs, and products are constantly changing or becoming obsolete, the goal is to have a laboring class that can do what they're told and quickly adapt to new industrial techniques with limited training. All the worker needs to do is learn the system and know what buttons to push. They don't have to know anything about the product. They don't have to have any skill or talent. Just show up to work and follow the rules. Technique has been utilized to create a system that will squeeze the greatest amount of work out of the laborer for a given time that they're clocked in. Workers do not even need to speak the same language or have any expertise in how the business is run. Just follow the system. As a result, we're increasingly alienated from our labor. Ooh, did I just do a Marxism? I'm sorry if I stray from the 3x5 card of classical liberal opinion here and say anything other than Karl Marx is bad. And he is largely, but he did make several good points in his writings that are worth paying attention to. And no, that doesn't make me or you or anyone else a leftist or part of the woke right for saying so. Let the listener understand. Alienation from labor is a real problem. The fact that workers do not have a personal investment in anything they make has created a situation where workers do not experience a sense of vocation, but rather, more often than not, mere drudgery. In trying to produce more stuff more efficiently, workers feel they have no stake in what they produce and take no pride in the outcome of their labor. So, what does modern society do to fix that sense of drudgery? Provide more products and entertainment to consume. Keep people looking forward to the weekend where they can get away from work and distract themselves from that drudgery of the workplace. Work hard so you can Play hard. Work those materials so you can play with the materials. Now hold that thought. We're going to be coming back to it. What are some political implications? As technique inevitably expands, the state takes over technology and increases in power. More technology requires more regulation and a larger and larger state. As systems become more complex, the state becomes more powerful to regulate those systems. Furthermore, technology is expensive. In many cases, it's only the state that can justify the investment required to implement that new technology. Now, as much as libertarians might want to say that the state does not have to do such things, and this can be done by private business alone, this is simply not true. It's a theoretical belief that does not conform to reality. Go back in the illustration, I mentioned the railroad before. Go back to that railroad illustration. In the 1800s, railroads were built across this country, linking the West Coast to the East Coast. Now, think of the massive undertaking that was. Land had to be cleared, entire people groups removed or obliterated. The federal government issued massive land grants and subsidies to railroad companies to build those railroads. Wars had to be fought, landscapes altered. What private business has the power or the resources to do something like that? I don't care how rich you are. But you may say, I heard there were maybe at least one railroad that was put in without a federal subsidy. Yeah, fair enough, true. It was the Great Northern Railroad. But even there, without the government's backing, enabling the railroad to claim land without paying market prices for it, it never would have been put in. But you might say, we could have just chosen not to put in the railroad. It's always there. True, but given technique's captivity of our imagination, in the language of the 19th century would convince everyone that railroads were inevitable. This just had to be done. Think of all the commerce. Think of all the good this will do us. Think of all the progress. We can't be left behind. Implication number one, then, technique means more government. More technique means more government. Secondly, in terms of political implications, more wars are needed to provide opportunities for the advancement of technique. Wars provide the emergency situation that eliminates any reservations about the use of technique. You say, whoa, do we want to go down? Do we want to start using that technology? Oh, it's emergency. Guess we have to. Just think over the wars of the past century for more than 5 minutes, and you'll see that is true. The major economic advancements we have enjoyed over this past century have come due to war. War is the breeding ground for technique. And I'm not just talking about wars against foreign armies. Whether it's a war on drugs, or a war on poverty, or a war on terror, or a war on climate change, or a war on COVID, wars call for the expansion of technique that the managerial class is only too willing to provide. Third implication, politically. Technique makes constitutional government irrelevant. Technique is by definition totalitarian. Between politicians and technicians, Ellul says, technique will always win. Politicians are not going to risk their careers by taking a non-technical option when faced with a problem. The politician who opts for a technical solution to every problem can always fall back on the claim that they followed the science, or followed the experts, or followed the right systems, even if the decision is a disastrous one. The politician who rejects the technical solution, however, will be vilified as a moral monster for not choosing efficiency and will be voted out. Thus, regardless of who you vote for, technique always wins. The techniques of governance remain in place. Furthermore, propaganda will always be used to justify the political decisions made. Democratic societies are especially diluted with propaganda. We don't lead with ideas. We lead with propaganda. And I'm not talking about campaign ads during this time of the year. That's not the propaganda I'm talking about. Those are the easy ones to spot. That's probably the least dangerous propaganda out there. That's what we're most alert to. I'm talking about the propaganda we take in every single day, unaware of the fact we're doing so. Our minds have been trained to think based on propaganda. We can't step out of the matrix because we've been so programmed to think in terms of efficiency. Our technique solves our problems, and when it creates new problems, we immediately start to look for new techniques to solve those problems. We can only think in terms of technical solutions. Okay, let's get into religious implications. Remember I said a moment ago that man alienated from his labor, the worker alienated from their labor, finds comfort in consumption. Well, while technique may make work tedious, the positive trade-off is greater efficiency and more products. Consumption is needed to increase demand. The result is that the consumer sees the world as materialistic and malleable. Technique changes the way we see the world and the way we think about nature. Everything produced in our minds is a result of systems, techniques, and machines. Technique then presents reality to us in an artificial way. Now, for example, what I'm talking about, an easy example is when you watch a movie, you see only what the camera wants you to see, right? We all know that. What you don't see is everything else that is going on set, outside of the frame of the camera. Now, this is fine for a movie. You know the filmmakers are framing reality for you, and that is why you're asked to suspend belief, right? When you walk into a movie theater, you don't look at the action movie and say, that was fake. You buy into it and you enjoy the movie, even though you know it's being framed for you. But the fact is, we all need to understand that technique frames our entire lives for us the exact same way. Because of technique, the way we have been taught to think as moderns excludes the possibility of a natural world. Modern man then has no category for natural law. The experience of modern man is that the world is made up of materials that can all be bent to our will to make what we want and to do so ever more efficiently. All of reality can be shaped the way we want it. And why not? There's always a tool. There's always a machine. Or as a few years ago, the popular line, there's an app for that. Just think of how much the real world is mediated to us through a device we can hold in our hand. Thus, moderns increasingly believe that all of nature is a mere social construct. With a bit of coding and rewiring, anything can be altered. Now, think about that. A world of technique in which everything is merely malleable material. If that is all that reality consists of, do you think it's a mere coincidence that atheism has become increasingly plausible as a worldview in such a world, and that Christianity has become increasingly implausible? Don't buy the lie that the decline in religious belief in the modern world is simply the result of scientific discoveries, such that we no longer need God. It's very clear that the modern world needs God. That's why people are inventing new and crazier religious beliefs all the time. On the contrary, it has been the use of technique that has made the possibility of God's existence increasingly implausible to the modern mind. In the ancient pagan world, which was still very much connected to nature, the world was a scary place. There were many gods out there, and those gods were arbitrary and capricious. The way to survive was to stick closely to the polis, to the city. It was in the city that provided you the security against the unpredictability of the gods and nature. You sacrificed to the gods as a city in the hopes of survival and blessing, recognizing your dependence on other agencies out there in the world. Christianity came along and recognized there was one God, and he was bigger than the city and bigger than nature itself. He was distinct from nature. He ruled over all of nature and creation. Paul testifies to this to the Athenians in Acts 17. This was the medieval world. God ruled over the heavens and the earth. You have one agency out there. But it is an agency. There's a power out there, and you better align yourself with that power in order to provide some security or safety. You are beholden to God's will. In modern times, rather than recognizing agency in the world at all, we see an agentless world. The world is just malleable materials. And technique is mere power that can always come up with a solution to bend those materials to our will. Man is in control. There's no need for God. Thus, Joseph Minnick, in his book Bulwarks of Unbelief, concludes, quote, "It is not that there is no longer a philosophical argument for invisible realities. On the contrary, many classical arguments are compelling, but they belong to a discourse that is unnatural to us and was quite natural in its original context. As such, their persuasive power depends upon accounting for this disjunct and attempting to reharmonize our reality instincts with the conclusions of our free minds." End quote. As such, any aspect of reality that does not conform to the materialistic assumptions of the modern world is perceived as non-existent. So you can make those classical arguments. But for a world that can't imagine invisible realities beyond the material world, they fall flat. Our Bible was written in a non-mechanical world, a world where there were spiritual agencies higher than man. Do you think it was a coincidence then that Jesus just happened to be born, say, in a non-mechanical world? Is it an accident that Jesus taught using organic rather than mechanical metaphors? Is it by chance that we have parables that describe natural rather than artificial environments? You see, in the parables, we have farmers who sow, vine branches that are cut off, trees that do not produce fruit. In the parables, we are invited to see the Christian life organically rather than mechanically. We are to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit, not follow the 7-step program. Have you ever thought about this? How are we supposed to understand the parables without an understanding of where food comes from? Most people don't. And that might sound like an exaggeration, but the more I find out, I think most people don't. Where does food come from? The grocery store, which is why there's a panic during COVID when there's no food in the grocery store. Why didn't the system produce the food? So how are we supposed to understand an organic world that the Bible presents to us in a world that has been framed for us by technique and we can only think in mechanical categories? We eliminate the need for an environment of spiritual growth in our mechanical world. Because we live in a world of technique, everything in the world's a material that can be used, a tool that can be employed, a means to something, to our end. We tend to have a technological view, and we eliminate a need for an environment for spiritual growth. How are you supposed to grow the fruit of the Spirit? Well, I don't understand that it comes from a whole process in nature. I don't understand that it needs an environment. So, then what is the church? What is the church? Is it a place to acquire some more facts about God or Bible trivia? Or is it a mother, as Cyprian of Carthage said, which is necessary for producing life, and as necessary as God our Father? Notice the organic language. God our Father, church our mother. What is our Bible? Is it a tool, a piece of technology that I use for finding proof texts, finding answers to life's problems, finding the keys to success? Me and my Bible app. Or is it the living Word of God to be publicly read in community, to dwell richly within the body of Christ through teaching wisdom and the singing of psalms and hymns? Colossians 3:16. What are the sacraments? What is baptism? Is the water a material that I use to make a statement about my faith? Or is it life-giving water that now saves you as a pledge of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Christ? 1 Peter 3:21. What is the celebration of the Eucharist? Are the bread and wine materials that I use as visual aids to remind myself of what Jesus did? Or is it a participation in the very body and blood of Christ? 1 Corinthians 10:16. What is worship? Is it a time of music to get me in the right mood to hear a sermon? Or is it the joining of the church militant with the saints of the church triumphant and the angels and the heavenly hosts around the throne of God? Revelation 4. What if worship is a time for taking a break from imposing our will on the world, from consuming and entertaining ourselves, and instead we receive the grace of God and participate in heavenly life? This is how we live the Christian life in the technological society, or any society for that matter. I don't have a master plan or a strategy or a technique that includes throwing out your cell phone and walking to work. We must begin by simply recognizing the environment we are in, the environment in which we find ourselves, and the ways in which technique shapes the way we think about the world. We must be aware of how technological society creates, to use Joseph Minnick's title, bulwarks of unbelief, especially for our children. We must not underestimate the power of nature and the natural order to remind us of our frailty as human beings. Connection with the natural order is a good thing. It is meant to point to the greater reality. The heavens declare the glory of God. We must remind ourselves the power of God as we can see it in creation and have witnessed even just these last few weeks with the hurricanes. We must place ourselves in the proper environment to grow. Our churches should not be one more place to employ technique, to make Christianity feel more relevant or attractive. but a place to be nourished and to participate in the fellowship of the mystery, the death and resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That is how we live in the technological society. That's it.